I'm so pleased to be joined by you all. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this. And I want to start by discussing the gaps. It felt right to kind of set the scene by talking about what are the skills or the knowledge or the other capabilities that are both critically critically important for leaders to have in a world where we're facing these increasingly complex sustainability challenges, but also that you don't think that either education systems or later training are providing. And because we've got a short time for a big discussion, I think let's sort of use this just to set the scene. So briefly share one or two examples, maybe picking examples that you find particularly surprising or concerning. And I'll just go down. So maybe if we start with you, Kirsten, what are a couple of quick examples that come to mind for you?
That's a wonderful question. I'm going to give two. The first is a question of scale. We have a tendency in this field to talk about impact and scale as an entirely one-directional function. And I think it's because the problems and the challenges that we're facing are so large but not insurmountable. It's also really important to be thinking about scale as a process of looking down and in, particularly in that vast missing middle of small and mid-sized social enterprises where the work is really happening at ground level. The second thing I would say, and I'll be really interested to hear what all of you, particularly who are in curriculum development, have to say about this, is that education continues and that the training, the skills that the young workforce is developing in school, in their professional development, continues once they're in the workforce. They are often called on to be the advocates and the teachers and the ambassadors for the work that they're doing to their own clientele in building their markets outward facing once they come into the working world.
That's great. So I think as well, I'm really passionate about being clear about the difference between impact and scale, that sometimes depth requires local context. So we can definitely come back to that. So thinking about scale, thinking about lifelong learning. Viviana, what about you?
Thank you for the question. I don't think there's a better time in history to talk about people and human capital. And just following a bit the conversation from this morning that started with systems thinking, we are in the middle of a systems revolution. Right? Most of our design, both in the economics and the infrastructure, has been based on a linear model when the change is exponential. This is not about sustainability. This is about sustainability, AI, geopolitics, everything. So if we're entering an adaptation phase, I am surprised/shocked, now positive, that actually it's a perfect moment to rethink the education system upstream, downstream. But if you're in an organization where, until that thing happens, you need to upskill your entire workforce yesterday, not tomorrow, today, this is happening. Whether you have 10 employees or 500,000 people in your workforce, like Walmart. So what is happening? That the workforce is becoming the university. I'll give another example. We have 1 million jobs in the US open for cybersecurity. Who is fulfilling those jobs? Who is training the people for cybersecurity? It's Google who is doing that. Most of the innovation in the, coming from the university, I would love your views on that, because I'm working on workforce development in different areas, cross-functionally, coming from private sector and from consumer goods. I do think that the opportunity for human capital is critical, especially in AI revolution, because it's almost like a reminder that we are going to need a people-centric model. I don't think this is about resources, whether if it's right pocket or left pocket, never ever we've been so wealthy. It's not $100 trillion in the economy. It's $1.4 quadrillion estimated in the economy. So I'm pretty sure we'll figure it out where to get the money from. And the SDGs, even to cover those SDGs, is 0.000% of the numbers that I just mentioned. So the money will figure it out. Technologies, we know they will be coming, but I think in a lot of the conversations, the human capital and people component is missing. So the market is self-regulating, because if the workplace is becoming the university, I would say that the number one missing thing is that systems thinking and that interdependencies that, business schools don't have it. They have it in the engineer school. They have it in public policy, or probably West Point Academy military will have it cross-functionally, but no other university.
I massively want to come back to that. Yeah, there's loads to come on there. So thinking in systems and also thinking about where people learn. Over to you, Maria.
Yeah, so just kind of building on what Viviana just said, I think this idea of systems thinking is essential.
Yeah.
So the notion notion of interdisciplinarity, it becomes crucial. So how do you bring a multifaceted perspective to sustainability, where you bring, the knowledge, the methods from different disciplines together into what we learn and try to approach sustainability from a systemic approach. So I think that's definitely key. The second thing, which is maybe a bit more unusual, but I think there's a gap in storytelling. We need to ensure that we leverage storytelling as a way to enable engagement, as a way to drive behavioral change, as a way to get buy-in for all of these things. These are difficult conversations. We're, a lot of the young generation that we are, because I come from a business school, they're kind of sick of these conversations. So how do we get the right story? How do we get the right message across so that they're receptive and they're ready to engage and they're ready to hit their jobs, ready and passionate about the topic, and not just like, oh, this is one more sustainability thing I need to learn about. So storytelling, I think, is a crucial skill that we need to build on for younger generations.
That's a great one. Yeah, we'll definitely come back to these ones. And then Mark, last not least on this one.
I was going to say systems thinking and storytelling, but they've just been said.
That's really interesting.
Great mind thinks alike.
But
Okay.
I would also try and separate out between knowledge and skills.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of people inside an organization that have skills. So, for example, accountants have been making sense of what they measure for many, many years. And yet we're setting up separate systems, sometimes outside of those accountants, where they're perfect for collecting the sustainability data as well. So actually separating the knowledge and the skills. And actually there's lots of people inside a business with skills that we're not necessarily utilizing.
Yeah.
So that would be something we should think about.
I think that's fascinating. And what I found really interesting about the notes that you all shared before this discussion is that there was a common theme that there's a need, yes, for different types of knowledge, capabilities, skills, a blend of all of these, but also for a shift in perspective, which I think came out here, that we need a perspective that our leadership and our education and our strategies, our operations, all need to be thought about in a context of a world that is facing these massively complex sustainability challenges. So we shouldn't just be teaching modules on sustainability at business school. We should be designing the whole curriculum, every module, from strategy to leadership to operations management, in a way that prepares leaders for that world, and that those are different things. And equally, we shouldn't just have our ESG specialists within a business, but we should design our whole business for that world. And that's a different perspective that I think maybe organizations are at different stages on that journey, shall we say. And Mark, you talked about the difference between sustainability as a profession and sustainability as a practice. I think that links to what you were just saying. Is there more that you want to say about that?
I understand last night there was over 100 CSOs met here after the event and were talking about what they are doing as a profession. I think that profession is growing massively over the last few years, but it is back to trying to utilize the skills of the people we've got in these organizations already. I started out back in the 90s almost getting arrested because I was trying to do the right thing, but the company didn't necessarily understand it. I'll tell you that story later over a drink. But the point being is that there's a lot of people that want to do the right thing within an organization. So how is it we can release that? That's the only way we're really going to build a sustainable business. It's not by having experts, because if you're continually going to an expert for the answer, you're not taking responsibility for it yourself.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, because I think the skills-based is critical. And now that forcefully by AI, a lot of companies are saying, okay, so if we're going from a general role to skill-based, and let's say there's a role with 10 skills, 7 of which will be automated. I would like to talk about the opening space for new, because a lot of the struggle in all of these topics become overwhelming because we think there's something more on top of. We first also need to give space and stop things that no longer work, both in curricula and in business, right? What took us here, but is not going to take us there.
Yeah.
So we can open space for the rest. So if that person has now 70% of time that we could optimize elsewhere, where is it that we need those new skills? Because LinkedIn and Salesforce and all of the studies of workforce development, what are they saying? This is about mostly EQ rather than IQ right now. Because with AI and other very cool stuff, we had a lot of answers. It's very different, the type of leadership roles or other specific roles that we will need in terms of working with the people in a different way. And you mentioned before, early education. Most of the innovation is coming from coders that started at 7, 6, 8 years old. A lot of the entrepreneurs didn't even go to college or university. So even when in academia, we ask the question, how do we teach ethics to Elon Musk, for example? Did Elon Musk went to university? Well, not much. And that's okay, right? So it's about finding the people where they need it in the organization, with the startup, or with the decision makers that are saying out loud, we are overexposed and underprepared for this level of transformation.
Do you have the sense, though, because I still feel like that requires a sense of constantly having in mind the context, the kind of world that we're operating in order to see those things, in order to see what needs to shift or the opportunities. And I say that as someone who's just finished an MBA late last year, which I loved and was really fantastic. But for example, the leadership module had a couple of hours session on sustainability. Yeah. Why wasn't the entire module about leading in a world in which we're facing these kinds of challenges? And so it's that shift, and it's not about tacking it on as an extra. And I think that's just such a theme that's come across from all of the things that you're saying. And I'm sure that you would have more to say about that, because that's exactly what you're doing.
That's exactly what I do. That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
And I think, if some of you were here this morning, we started the conference with a very nice video on sustainability, great video, by the way, except that you talk about collaboration between business and policy. And we don't talk about education. And yet, what was said before is that we don't need change in 10 years. We need our graduates this summer, they're hitting your companies tomorrow, or at the end of the summer in September, and they need to be ready to change things from inside. So education is essential. We cannot not be talking about education and skills. We have a massive skill gap. We know there's big demand and not enough supply. We have the survey from LinkedIn that tells us that only 1 out of 8 people have some sort of green skill or sustainable skill. We're not ready for this. And that's where education comes in. And I completely agree with you that education, higher education, and particularly business schools, need to take a big step back and just kind of look at what we're doing and question ourselves. Are we relevant in today's world? Are we relevant? Is our content helping us get closer to the 1.5? Are we getting closer to those big objectives? And I think the answer today is that, well, we are not there yet. We are quite far. And I think there are some schools that are doing things. We are trying to do that. We are revisiting, redesigning all of our courses, all of our programs. It's a massive change. We've implemented a mandatory training for all of our staff and our faculty to be able to enable that change. And the outcome of that needs to be redesigned courses, redesigned programs that don't only just look at sustainability as a mandatory course, but have this kind of seamless integration of sustainability in all disciplines. Yes. You talked about your MBA. Well, that's exactly what we want. But that's not an easy task, because you need to get people, professors, to change the way they do, to change the approach and the pedagogical tools and methods that they use to achieve that. And that's very hard. But we have to get there, because if you don't have education as a driver, then education is happening within companies, and it's kind of like you're never catching the tail.
It's formally educating, but we're all having to learn within our organizations about how we enable this shift. So let's talk about how we do that. So we've had some examples of the ways you're thinking within a formal education context about how can we shift to a completely different perspective that thinks in systems, that constantly brings in the context of the kind of world that we have to lead in.
And just super quickly, we often have courses on sustainable finance, sustainable supply chain. We need to phase out of that. Sustainability is business. Business is sustainability. So if we keep on having these sustainability finance courses there, it still sends a message that sustainability is kind of the sack thing.
Completely.
So we need to change that. And that's going to take a little bit of time. But our goal is to do this by 2026, have like a full overhaul of what we're doing. But it is very complex. And the market needs to be ready for that as well. We need to collaborate with companies, with policymakers as well. And we need to be having these conversations at the higher level.
Do we have other examples from the panel about things you've seen where you have seen successfully a shift towards more kind of systemic, context-based thinking of the kind that we're talking about here? Maybe Kirsten.
I'd love to share one. And so much of what we're talking about is integration of thinking, right? Integration of practice, integration of preparation, practice, and storytelling. So I'll give an example, actually, of a company that I just recently, they're in our portfolio. NESsT works with some very small companies. We work with early stage SMEs, socially impactful SMEs. And they, I find, have some of the best orientation toward that integrated thinking. And they also have the nimbleness to be able to put it into effect, if they think of themselves that way. So we have a company in our acceleration portfolio that is a paper company. And they tell a story around dignified employment for migrants and refugees. That's how they came to enter our portfolio, and that is the focus of how we work with them and their impact. But when I went and actually toured, I realized that they were also doing highly conscious work around circular economy. They have almost no paper waste. Why? Because they're too small to have a CSO. So everybody is the CSO, which means the people who are laying out the die cuts and the print runs are thinking about how they can do it in the most efficient way. So there is almost no offcut. And what small amount of paper waste there is shredded and used for concrete, sold and used for concrete. So it's an additional revenue stream for them. It's material that is not going into landfill. It's dignified employment, which was their initial premise, and it is a surprisingly green impact for an industry that is not generally known as being environmentally advanced.
That's awesome.
And yet it's doing all of those things. And this is a small company. And so that's why I always bring up the point about scale.
Yeah.
It's not a huge ship to turn. It's a series of small decisions where the workforce is engaged in making those decisions and is part of the leadership. But it starts with the leadership. The leadership had to make the commitment.
If I may, I have a good example on amplifying that. With business schools in Africa. So I'm collaborating with different regions and work streams at a national level in the US, international, and in Prime last year in the United Nations, we met groups that because of need and less resources, they're actually innovating way faster than the big universities that traditional you would imagine. So in Africa, they are doing consortiums of, let's say, 20 universities, and they say, well, I have to innovate very quickly, not just sustainability, but AI, bam, 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 bam. So they're doing it all together at the same time, which is actually leapfrogging where the big universities are. And it's just fascinating because it really opens the door now to a broader conversation on social justice and includes, economic opportunities and mobility for underserved areas.
It also links to the systems thinking point, because one of the things we know about complex systems is that they're really, really localized. And so actually people who are empowered right on the front line to see what's going on in a very complex context and act are often better able to come up with solutions. And I want to come to Mark, but just before I forget, want to pick up on something that you said about dignified employment, because I think that's such an interesting thing that's come across from the notes we had before and what's coming out here. Is we think about scale and we ask about numbers. One of the questions has been about the numbers, even in the discussion before now, talking about how can we measure that we're making progress on these things. When you start to think about some of the things that are profoundly important, like dignity, I think it's really important for us to remember that there are some things that we require us to think in a completely different way. If we want to be really quantitative about how we do this, then then we're going to miss out some of the things that are most important. And one of the shifts in perspective and thinking are to be talking about things like dignity and how we can understand that and how we can look for it and bring it about. And that again is a massive shift in perspective, I think, because we want to hold ourselves accountable by looking at the numbers, and often with the kinds of things that are really important for achieving environmental and social progress, those things are much harder to quantify. Mark, I want to give you time because I want questions from the audience as well.
So the whole point about trying to look at problems in a different way is really what we're talking about here. So when you're thinking about sustainability, it's coming at it from a different place, and therefore that's why you need to rely on different skills. We've been, on the measurement question, we've been working very closely with a high street bank over the last 6 months, and with value. So we look at natural capital, social capital, the trust in the systems, the institutions, human capital. Actually, you can measure the living wage. We just heard from Linklaters earlier on. We've been working with Shift in the US, actually on an accounting process for measuring the benefits that come from that. And remember, we're talking about businesses here that want to see the benefits of all the things we're talking about here.
Yeah.
What happened with this high street bank is that after we had all of the different silos in all the different departments, at the end of 6 months, they'd basically broken down those different silos they had and were working to a common purpose. That's what came out of it, not the accounting bits which we were trying to build in. The biggest outcome was the integration of the way they were thinking about the problems and actually using the skills in a different way for a common purpose. That was what was really driving them.
But if I make the market, actually, if being at The Economist, and if I am to send a quick message to asset managers and asset producers, the root cause of human capital seen as a cost and a liability, it's because it is in the balance sheet a cost and a liability. So if we were to move, I mean, this is the design of the 1970s of our economy, but if we move that into a asset, if we consider people as assets, the conversation is very different. And that's why in the ESG, 20% of the social aspect is one of the reasons, because we see human capital as a cost.
Can I just add to that? Because we've done a lot of work and we must share reports. But on that, if you look for oil and gas and you start looking, that is amortized over a period of time, it goes in as an asset. So you can do research into oil and gas and it's not actually going onto the balance sheet in the same way as people do. Exactly. So people, if they're really our greatest asset, why are we still dealing with them as a cost? You talk to a CEO will say, of course I want to pay a living wage. The CFO will turn around and say, it's actually going to increase our costs. We need to think about this. Well, actually, it's because of the way we're accounting for it.
Can I give an example of that from
please.
NESsT is primarily known as an accelerator. We also run 2 smallish investment funds. And let me give an example of how that then translates into the work that we do. Small fund, 7.3 million assets under management as of today, right? But that 73% of the companies that we're invested in have women in leadership, right? And that's not a nice to have. For the investors in the room, our net write-offs are 2.5%. These are extremely successful businesses, right? And so we're talking about things that when you invest in people, when you invest in companies that are committed to these impacts, the impact measurement also follows. And I think getting away from this false binary thinking about either you're good to your people or either you're good to the planet or you can be successful in business is just, all of us who are in this practice understand that that's wrong, and yet we still continue to have this argument.
And it's a critical path to realize anything about the transition economy, really. There is no point in realizing the trillions of dollars that have been invested if we don't overinvest in the human capital. Because we will need the people for that.
Powerful final sentence, because I'm terrified by the bright red thing that is telling me that we're running out of time, and I feel like we could have spoken for another hour. It's difficult to sum up, but I think for me, the key takeaway here is that so much of the things we're talking about are about a shift in perspective, a shift in the way that we're thinking, not necessarily needing new knowledge or new skills, but thinking differently about how they're used, and finding ways to account for things that have to be accounted for in a slightly different way in the world that we're in, whether that's that's human capital, that's human skills, it's things like dignity. Does that feel like a fair summary?
It's people.
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 Thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed this. Can we do a quick round of applause, please, for such great speakers? Thank you.